Alright, here we are again. This is chapter 8. I'm busting these these videos out one at a time, so that's why I'm wearing pretty much the same clothes as I was for chapter 6 and 7. This is a long chapter, so I'm not even going to try to pretend that this will be under 5 minutes. You can scrub through it if you get bored. But anyways, what's important to note about this chapter is that there is symbolism. I told you chapter 7 I don't really care about symbolism, but in this chapter certainly there is, and I will talk about that. I have some stupid little pictures that I drew up that will hopefully make you think about that a little bit more. Another important thing to note about chapter 8 is that this takes place in early winter. She said in chapter 7 that South Alabama doesn't really have seasons. It's just warm all the time, and certainly no winter, or usually no winter. But in this case, this year there is a winter. And that's really unusual for Scout. She's never seen snow before. I've got a friend who lives down in Florida, and her stepkids have never seen snow before because they grew up in Florida. And so something that we in Maine take for granted, some kids have never seen and are really amazed or just kind of curious about it. So it's early winter, and I can tell you based on what the chapters that follow this, it's before Christmas. I do know that. And so one thing that happens in this chapter right at the beginning is Mrs. Bradley died. So Boo's mom is dead, to put it bluntly. We've never seen Mrs. Bradley do much. So, Scout and Jem aren't really upset by that too much. It's just kind of curious. And when she wakes up and she sees snow, it starts snowing one morning. Scout is actually scared, like she screams, and Atticus is like, well, it's just snow. And they actually cancel school because it's never snowed, or it hasn't snowed in the area for years and years, like 1855, I can't remember the exact year. So they decided to just up and cancel school, even though everybody could have probably gotten to school just as pretty easily. 1885, sorry. So they cancel school, and the description that they have is on page 86 of what amount of snow they actually got is just a feeble layer of soggy snow. A feeble layer of soggy snow. So if you're in Maine, probably school would not be canceled for something like that. But
in this chapter, when it snows, there's barely enough snow.
I made a video, but I didn't want my voice. So this is the snow that we got on April 1st of this year in 2020. I was so angry when I got that snow. I thought it would be the last amount of snow that we would get for the year, and then April 9th happened last Thursday night, we got about a foot of snow, which was infuriating to me. But just picture, Maine, this is what we would consider pathetic snow. This is, I think, something like what they would have gotten. Try making a snowman out of this. If you're walking around, Jem yells at Scout because he says that she's ruining the snow. Even just picking up the snow on your shoes would ruin it, according to Jem. So hard to make a snowman out of that, and Jem has to get creative. And I actually went out and recorded this in my yard on April 1st, and there's actually a dirt pile. It's a filled pile that we have. I was going to show you, but you can't really see it. So anyways, just a visual of how much snow they've gotten. It's a pathetic amount. And Mr. Avery, the character that they saw in chapter 6 who was peeing off the porch, he's a grumpy old man, and he actually yells at the kids and tells them that it's bad children like you who make the seasons change. And so he blames the snow on the kids for being kids. He's kind of a miserable character. And so Scout, and that's actually kind of funny because Jim takes that to heart and actually gets his revenge on Mr. Avery in this chapter. Jim is obsessed with the snow, and he wants to build a snowman. And I'm really trying hard not to channel Frozen here, but he does want to build a snowman, but it's really not a lot of snow to do that. So what he does is he starts with the internal layer of mud. So at first he starts building a quote-unquote snowman with mud, and then he takes what snow that he can find and scrape up from his yard and Miss Maudie's yard, and he packs snow around the mud man. So it looks like a snowman, but on the inside it's mud. Now, that's the symbolism I want you to think about. That, we've got something that's brown on the inside, it's the color of mud, but white on the outside. It's just a thin layer of snow. We're talking about the color of people's skin in this chapter. I'm all but telling you what to think about the snowman here. But I do believe the snowman has to do with race and, what matters, what's on the inside of a person. So I drew this on MS Paint just to kind of show you, this is what the snowman actually is. It's mud on the inside and only a thin layer of white snow on the outside. So it appears to be a snowman. It appears to be a good snowman. But if you were to look at it on the inside, you could see that it's very different. Just like a lot of people appear to be respectable in this book, but then you take a look at how they act and what they are like on the inside, they're very different. Okay, I'm not going to belabor that symbolism much anymore, but I will tell you, I try not to tell kids what to think about the book, but I feel like this is very obvious. So do give that one a good think as you're reading this book and reading this chapter. So there's some other things that I want to talk about. Okay, so here's the first thing of the snowman. That's what it really looks like. But on the outside, obviously, you wouldn't see the mud. You would see just the white layer all around. I'm just kind of this is like a cross-section of the snowman, so you could see the inside of it. So what he does is he makes a character out of it, and he wants it to look like Mr. Avery. So you kind of see in the details, he makes the gut pretty big. He uses sticks that I first drew a little carrot because that's my temptation. Snowmen should have carrot noses, but they use wood. And he makes the snowman look angry, and Atticus is actually pretty impressed. He's like, oh, nice snowman. And then he looks closely, and he realizes that the snowman looks like Mr. Avery. And he's like, you've drawn a caricature in our yard. You can't do that. And Jim's like, oh, it just looks just like him, doesn't it? He's pretty impressed with himself. And so, which he, hey, should be. But Atticus can't have that. He can't have Jim, his kid, disrespecting the neighbors. So he's like, yeah, no, you gotta cover that up. Put an apron on it or something. So, this is something this is not what happens to the snowman, but he's like, yeah, give it a broom at least and an apron and disguise it. Jem doesn't want to do that. He doesn't want to give the snowman a broom and an apron. So we're back to this. So what he does is he can't have Mr. Avery the snowman anymore. So he goes over and he borrows Miss Maudie's clippers and her sun hat. So he throws the sun hat on Mr. Avery the snowman, and he gives Mr. Avery hedge clippers. And so it kind of looks something like this. Again, it's mud on the inside. And that's where things get a little confusing, I think, for Scout, and also kind of funny. So Miss Maudie sees what's happened to her hat. She yells for her hat, and she yells at Jim, and Atticus is like, don't even worry about it, she's just joking. But she yells to, and let me go to the page number, write down the page number. Yeah, it's page 91, where she starts yelling at Atticus about what she sees in the yard. So she says, actually I'll start on the bottom of page 90. I'm going way over the 5 minutes. Miss Maudie opened her front door and came out of the porch. She looked across the street at us. Suddenly she grinned. Jem Finch, she called. You devil, bring me back my hat, sir. Jim looked up at Atticus, who shook his head. She's just fussing, he said. She's really impressed with your accomplishments. Atticus strolled over to Miss Maudie's sidewalk, where they engaged in an arm-waving conversation, the only phrase of which I caught was, erected an absolute morphodite in that yard, Atticus. You'll never raise 'em. The word morphodite here, M-O-R-F-O, I'm sorry, wow, this is gray, M-O-R-P-H-O-D-I-T-E, that is not a word. Kind of like in chapter 7 when she says hoodooing, Scout says hoodooing instead of voodooing. Miss Maudie says morphodite, and Scout doesn't know what that word is, as you'll see in this chapter. I don't know what that word is. The best guess we can make is if we look at Mr. Avery the snowman, and the word morphodite, it looks like hermaphrodite. And Mr. Avery here is a man, was a man, but then he donned a sun hat and was given some head trimmers. So probably not a conversation that would, that's PC for the year 2020, but back then she would have called it, I guess, a morphodite or hermaphrodite is what she's talking about. So Scout has no idea what that word means, and neither do we really, because it's not really a word. It's just, something that Miss Maudie says. And we'll come back to that in just a second. So, or a few minutes. So they move on from the snowman, and the next big thing, this is a longer chapter, but the next big thing that happens in this chapter is Miss Maudie's house catches on fire. So when they're in bed, Atticus wakes them up at night, and he pulls them out because Miss Maudie's house is right next to their house. So let me zoom in. Here's Miss Rachel's house, here's Atticus's house here, and Miss Maudie's house. And they're actually concerned that the house is going to catch on fire, the entire neighborhood, and it might get Atticus's house. So Atticus brings his children outside. You don't want your children on the inside if the house is caught on fire. And he brings them down the road a little bit as they watch the people of the neighborhood run into Miss Maudie's house and bring as much furniture as they can out. They're trying to save her valuables. And you'll see that even Mr. Avery is trying to help, even though he was kind of the bad guy at the beginning of this chapter. He's being, they're actually concerned about, Jim and Scout are concerned about his safety. And he's kind of being a bit of a hero here, trying to help out Miss Maudie. Please don't run into burning buildings. This is something that they did back then, but I'm not encouraging it now. So her house catches on fire, and they're standing and watching this house just burn down all night. They're worried about their own house being, catching on fire. They're told, Atticus tells them to stay put, which they do. And actually, they're probably, it looks like it's a long ways away, but in the book it doesn't seem like it, because they're closer to their Radley yard. And they're able to see really what's happening in Miss Maudie's house all the way up here. So as they're reading, as they're watching the fire burn down this poor woman's house, Miss Maudie's house, they see that the fire department is actually throwing water on Atticus's house. They don't want his house to burn up. And she sees that, she mentions kind of casually, did I write down what page number? No, I didn't write down what page number. She watches, let's see if I can't find it so I can tell you the page number. That's somewhere in here. I wrote it. Anyways, she casually mentions as she watches the firemen spray water onto her house, and she watches as the absolute morphodite crumbles into coal and black. So their snowman that they built disappeared, and she calls it like our absolute morphodite, just kind of melted away. She's using that term casually. She thinks that a snowman is called an absolute morphodite. She doesn't understand what it means, and she just uses the word. As a kid, have you ever done that before? Have you ever used words that you didn't know what they meant? It turned out they were bad words. I did. I'm not going to put it on video, but I certainly have used words that I didn't understand what they meant. And that's kind of important for Scout, because there's another very derogatory word in this book, and she doesn't really understand its impact and its meaning. And I think that the use of the word absolute morphodite kind of highlights that. The fact that Scout is willing to just use words without really understanding what they mean. With the intent, with the connotation, everything, just the power behind those words. So she uses it fairly casually. And another thing that happens in this book is when Atticus calls them inside and is giving them hot cocoa, he actually yells at the kids, or not yells at them, but he's like, hey, I thought I told you to stay put. He notices that Scout has a blanket around her shoulders, and he thought that they must have gone somewhere to get the blanket. It's cold out. It had snowed that day. As they're watching this house burn down, they're stuck outside. They're in their PJs. Scout mentions that she was actually quite cold and Jim couldn't keep her warm. she does not realize that somebody put